Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Nicolai Petro, a professor at the University of Rhode Island, who also worked for the US State Department as a special assistant for policy on the Soviet Union. So, yeah, obviously a few years back. And the topic that I wanted to discuss with you today was the stability of the Zelensky government as the military, but also the nationalists group have, to a large extent, had a lot of veto power over Zelensky. I guess the power of the nationalists was always a bit of a controversial topic in the West. We even sometimes dismissed it as Russian propaganda, but again, this is very factually there's a lot of facts to prove this, but also recently we had this admission by Boris Johnson in an interview where he argued that Zelensky was a bit of a peacenik. He ran on the platform to implement the Minsk peace agreement 2019, which 73% of Ukrainians voted for, until the nationalists told him, no, you're not allowed to do this. Again, there was already a sea of evidence, but the media didn't report on it, and it was more or less dismissed. So, but
You got to remember that Volodymyr Zelensky is not, he's not an unreasonable guy. He got elected really as a peacenik. He was out that, 2019, he tried to do a deal with Putin. As far as I can remember, his basic problem was that the, Ukrainian nationalists couldn't accept the compromise, and you can see why.
but this is important because now that the war seems to be getting lost, what does this mean? What is will it be possible for him to negotiate peace without triggering opposition from the nationalists? But I guess before we delve into this, I was wondering perhaps you can give some background or context. What is the role of the nationalist or neo-fascist groups in addition within Ukrainian politics? Because they're not the majority, but they're surely a very powerful minority.
Right. So I do delve into this in greatest detail in my book, The Tragedy of Ukraine, although it only deals with events up to the beginning of 2023. It has an extensive section about the history of the various events that led up to the Russian invasion, including the emergence of the modern nationalist movement. So as it turns out, historically, there have been students of Ukrainian nationalism, which emerged as a political force in Ukrainian history in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. At that time, Ukrainian youth was engaged in exploring the question of why the efforts made by Ukrainian political elites at the time were unsuccessful in gaining an independent country, in establishing an independent Ukraine. And the consensus view at the time was that they were betrayed. They were betrayed by their allies in Europe. And of course, they were betrayed by Russian liberals. And of course, the question then became how to deal with those who had betrayed them. And during the interwar period, the great enemy of Ukrainian nationalist movements, which gradually formed student groups, but then moved from student groups on to becoming more militarized, were the Poles, because the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism, historical Galicia in Western Ukraine, was under Polish occupation at the time. And the emphasis on identifying and fighting against the oppressor only switched from Poland to the Soviet Union after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. and the subsequent incorporation of those regions into the Soviet Union. So after World War II, of course, there was, I should say, during World War II, these groups sought a de facto alliance with the German military. It remains a sore spot in Ukrainian historical analysis, as to whether this was clear subservience to Hitler's war objectives by the Ukrainian the Ukrainian military forces that joined in the campaigns of the German military, or whether this was a marriage of convenience in which the Ukrainians would have ultimately achieved their own objectives, or were trying to achieve their own objectives. I won't go into that debate because there's a lot of ink shed on this, and skip, however, to the fact that the Ukrainian nationalist cause was damaged by this association, and therefore did not do well after World War II. Although specific leaders and organizations were welcomed by Western intelligence services, specifically in Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States, as potential allies against the Soviet Union. So there was support offered to them on that basis. So essentially what we're talking about up until 1991 is an emigre community that sought to retain some sort of political ideology of nationalism in the hopes of someday influencing Ukrainian politics. That opportunity came in 1991, and there was a concerted effort by the second generation, sometimes even the third generation descendants of those who originally had allied with the Nazi armed forces, the German armed forces, to return to Ukraine and organize themselves there, already not as Nazis, of course, but as emigre groups with Ukrainian roots coming from Canada, the United States, and other countries. So all of that resulted in a very moderately, I should say, successful effort to establish a political continuity, new organizations which would attract people in especially Western Ukraine who were worried about whether Ukraine would be able to survive as an independent state, given the amount of cultural ties, including Soviet nostalgia, that remained among a large portion of the population, most especially in eastern and southern Ukraine. And it is on this basis that they began to support political parties like the Svoboda Party, which had a very strong nationalist orientation, and eventually captured up to 10% of the seats in the elections, I believe, of 2010 or thereabouts. And as a result, became a political force, in addition to which they had already established themselves as the dominant political forces in key Western regions of the country. And building on this, alongside this political growth, they also established paramilitary units. Again, you have to understand that in the context of this kind of nationalist tradition, they were worried about the loyalty of the new Ukrainian government to what they consider to be true Ukrainian identity. And the best way to think about nationalist movements since 1991 and through to the present in Ukraine is that they do not think of themselves as political parties. They do not think of themselves as merely one social movement among a variety of social movements. They see themselves as a knighthood, as an order, if you will, defending the true identity and mission of Ukraine. So all other social forces, be it cultural, be it political, be it religious or military, must be guarded against the temptation to veer away from the this kind of social identity which defines a Ukraine for Ukrainians, not a mongrel Ukraine, not a Ukraine that is in any way diverse and multicultural. It must be a pure Ukraine with a pure Ukrainian ideology. And we can go into the details of what that ideology entails if you wish, but I think I've gone on long enough for a while.
So all the millions of not just ethnic Russians, but even more Russian speakers, those connected to Russian culture, the Russian Orthodox Church, these are all become considered to be foreign elements, which has infected the Ukrainian body of the Ukrainian national body, that is the nation.
But not only, we must include in those non-Ukrainians, Hungarians, Poles, Romanians, Bulgarians, Jews, of course, as an ethnic group. So it is really an attempt to cleanse and remove the impurities that have infected Ukraine, which for Ukrainian nationalists are the very source of the problems, all the problems that you see, including corruption, including lack of unity, including lack of vision, lack of focus. And what they are envisioning is a rather, I can't say this for everyone, but if you go back to the writings of the 1930s, many of which are still circulated today as guides for what Ukraine ought to become, it is a rather rural, bucolic vision, a sort of an idyllic version of a home and hearth by a small homestead that would define the proper Ukrainian social matrix. And anything that is industrial, anything that would bring into Ukraine the influences of foreign elements, open the country to greater visions and diversity, would be very much opposed by mainstream Ukrainian nationalists.
So what was the role since 2014? Because again, one shouldn't take it at face value, but some of these groups, like the neo-fascist group C14, there's a very famous panel where the leader of it is discussing that they were the real spearhead, that is the nationalists at Maidan, and also the reason why the West supported them is because they were willing to use violence. I think he argued something along the lines that we have fun when we kill, something along those lines.
Але стільки зброї не тому, що ми хороші, як нам кажуть, нам допомагає Захід, бо вони хочуть нам блага, тому що ми виконуємо задачі Заходу. Тому що ми єдині, хто готові їх виконувати, бо нам весело, нам прикольно убивати і прикольно воювати. І вони думають, вау, давайте вже подивимося, що це буде. Тому виник цей новий альянс, про який зараз говорять там Туреччина, Польща, Британія, Україна. Тут ми тут флагман. Тому що ми затіяли війну, якої не було вже останніх 60 років. Так от, уявіть собі, скільки в нас зброї, скільки в нас ветеранів. А тепер уявіть, зникає Росія, вона розвалюється. Тобто виникає там 5 Росій, там Неда Росії і так далі. На європейському континенті найбільше. Тільки в Британії там, здається, більше. Ви розумієте, цей потенціал цих збройних сил, це стане проблемою зразу для всіх, хто зараз там десь там намагається робити хенькі уколи. І оце от є наша радість і наша печаль. Чому, щоб ви розуміли, чому так все важко? Не тому, що ми, українці, 300 років, наша дупа страждала, чому ж нарешті влада до нас не впаде, ми такі хороші, ми хочемо в Європу. Ні, це величезна, потужна держава, і якщо ми тут прийдемо до влади, це буде і радість, і проблеми для всього світу. Тому це величезна амбітна задача. Ми живемо дуже в класний час, і тому перед нами стоять надзвичайно амбітна, класна ціль. Не просто стати там частинкою європейської сім'ї, яка вже там розвалилася, а це є, вже йдеться про те, що нові політичні альянси вже глобального рівня.
It's also been in the work of Kachanovsky argues that the nationalists were also quite involved in the sniper shooting. But from Maidan and onwards, how were they able to influence politics to such an extent?
How was a minority able to dictate to the majority is what you're asking. And that's it's less difficult to understand than we think, because in any democracy or in any social organization, really, there are always influence groups. There are groups that exert more influence and less influence. In our own social systems in the West, we understand that intuitively, but we often see it as a function of this influence being a function of wealth. But it is also, of course, as classical social scientists have always pointed out, a function of the ability and willingness to exert violence. If you don't have wealth, then you can certainly dictate to a significant degree the outcome of politics by virtue of being willing to exert violence against your opponents. And that has been, I think, the calling card of the nationalists. And again, as we know from totalitarian regimes, you don't need to exert violence at a high level of intensity consistently. You mainly need to show your willingness to do so, and your willingness to do so in a few key examples results in the conditioning of others to do your will because they fear that they might be the next target. What led to the rise of the far right in politics after 2014? They became, in fact, the salvation of, it is plausible to argue, the salvation of the Ukrainian state. Because if we think back to what happened after Crimea seceded from Russia, I'm sorry, seceded from Ukraine, and then Donetsk and Lugansk were attempting to do the same thing, the Ukrainian army initially refused to shoot on its own civilians. And the legality of the so-called anti-terrorist operation, as the military campaign of the post-Maidan government in Kiev was called with respect to what it was trying to do in recapturing the rebel regions in Donbass. That legality was questioned in the Ukrainian parliament. So during this period of time, the far right began to enact its vision of itself as the guarantor of Ukrainian statehood, and used the weapons and the training that they had gained through the last 2 decades in their paramilitary camps to launch assaults and seize back territory as much as possible in the east against Donbass. So this, we thought, was originally done independently of the Ukrainian authorities. But then Dmitry Yarosh, the head of the right sector forces at the time, subsequently admitted that this was done with the support of the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, Alexander Turchinov. So this became, in fact, the melding. This was the first melding, I would say, of Ukrainian authority with these paramilitary units. And the fact that they stepped into the breach when the police and the armed forces were not ready to do so vastly increased their influence in the subsequent policies of the post-Maidan government. And whether this is true or not, we will never know because the historical period has passed. But it seems that the government in place in 2014 and 2015 in Kiev felt honestly that they could not hold on to power without this, without the support, the military support of the far-right groups, which they didn't want to acknowledge as such. They were trying to shy away from it because they were trying to portray themselves as more democratic and liberal to their Western supporters. But in the background, they understood very well that their power relied on the influence of the right sector. And many portfolios in the government were given to members of the far right in that initial post-Maidan government, which again suggests or is a way of indicating their influence, because as a political force in the parliament, they didn't really exist as such.
Well, they still had power over it, because what was fascinating to me was both Poroshenko and Zelensky took a bit of a hostile or anti-nationalist approach initially, but we saw in 2015 there was this pressure on Parliament, as well as President Poroshenko approved of implementing the Minsk agreement, but then it was the nationalists who escalated the violence, even leading to death, and after this they didn't implement it. So the whole democratic process, Parliament, nothing really had. Everything could be vetoed, and of course the same with Zelensky. He was very openly threatened. You've probably seen the videos as well when he went to Solitaire to pull back the heavy weapons. They confronted him.
О том, что демилитаризация украинских кордонов, мы бы хотели это все обсудить и формализировать, чтобы потом не было как у Петра Алексеевича.
Ты со мной хочешь формализировать отношения?
В меморандуме.
Я с тобой?
Не я с вами, а все люди, которые в этом процессе, те, которым болит за Украину.
Яка капитуляция, про що так?
Формализация.
Я пришел, тебе сказал, вы оружие вывезете, а ты меня переводишь стрелки.
Так я вам второй момент уже озвучил. Я вас услышал, вы
Смотри,
сказали.
ты мне вообще не можешь никакие ультиматумы озвучивать, Денис, ты не понял.
Так я вам ультиматум, я говорю, это были люди.
Нам за эти оружие забрать?
При чем здесь? Я вам
не
говорю
понимаю,
за
чем мы
второй
закончим
момент.
сейчас разговор.
Так мы нормально общаемся.
Ну так и давай нормально общаться.
Ну, никто же вас не пытается макнуть никуда.
Что?
Вам передали то, что происходило в Украине, то, что люди
Кто
еще
мне
по
передал?
Украине.
Я же тебе говорю, ты мне скажи,
Так
кто?
я вам говорю, по Украине были акции.
Денис, по Украине вчера прошел дождь, вот что я слышу.
Ну, так я вам рассказываю о том, что
где
происходило.
акции? Кто мне что передал? Говорю, давай, что
Так
ты?
вот я вам и говорю, что люди хотят встречи с вами,
Какие люди? Денис,
которые
фамилию.
вышли на мероприятие под
Фамилию ты можешь мне сказать или нет? Ты что ты все
Ну,
время...
хотите,
весь день-
Плеханов, Кухарчук, ну это по разным областям.
Ну,
Дроздов
Денис,
и
это же так не
дальше.
делается.
Ну, так не, ну так
Не,
спросили,
еще,
я
подожди,
передал.
вышел Стадник вам, Николай
Да.
Вечеров,
Ну,
вышел,
наш губернатор.
передал
Савина.
письмо, да, или что вы ему там,
передать
вернее, вы
президенту.
ему передали.
Передали
Конечно,
письмо?
для президента.
Ну, он мне передаст, я прочитаю.
Ну,
потом.
так вы же спросили, что там было. Я вам и рассказываю, что, собственно, в этом
Денис,
письме. Вы же
ладно,
сами спросили
Денис,
только что.
послушай,
Да,
я президент этой страны,
конечно.
мне 42 год. Я ж не лох. Я тебе пришел и сказал, оружие уберите, а ты меня не переводи на акции.
Причем
Про дочь
мы
и
с вами
про-
уже поговорили, вы потом
Я не
спросили за
поговорил с
следующее.
тобой, я хотел увидеть в глазах понимание.
Ну.
А увидел парня, который решил, что перед ним какой-то лопух стоит, и переводишь меня на другую тему.
Так какая другая тема? Мы уже этот момент обсудили, я вам следующим сказал
Нет,
еще один
я
момент,
услышал,
можно?
что окей. Ты мне скажи ок, все.
Ну так у нас нет оружия в руках. Ну,
Это
что?
значит, ты меня не услышишь.
Ну слушайте.
Парни, это я вам сейчас сказал серьезно.
People from parliament threaten him. You had people their right sector leader Yarosh also openly threatening to hang him from a tree if he would dare to implement his peace mandate. And so again, it was quite powerful. But anyways, I guess at that time, Zelensky, and much like Poroshenko, embraced the nationalists. Again, better to have them on the inside and fight with them. But we're now at this interesting point in time where the war is seemingly lost and at least reaching its final stages. The United States is seeking to distance itself from it. And there's a lot of pressure coming from the United States on Zelensky to accept peace. But to what extent is it possible, even if he would want to? Wouldn't the nationalists turn on him, or have they been weakened in places like Kursk, where a lot of them were sent? How do you read the situation? How stable is the current situation?
You're quite right to highlight the power of the nationalists in over the government relies on their ability to veto certain actions rather than initiate alternatives. Although I might argue that in the case of cultural, educational, and religious parties, the nationalist vision of Ukraine is currently holding sway. So there, indeed, they seem to be guiding the policies. But in matters of domestic economic policy and foreign policy, they seem to be exercising more of a veto power than an actual guiding role. So I think their power rests not on what they have actually been able to accomplish in terms of politics, these far-right organizations. And we have to remember that this is a coalition of organizations guided by a similar mindset, a similar way of thinking about the world. This is not a tightly structured organization. And as such, we also have to be aware that one of their weaknesses is their own internal infighting. Who's the most important? And sometimes this also does turn violent. And a second aspect of this, which is important to bear in mind, is the close relationship between the far right as an extra political group, as a series of extra political groups, with other extra political social forces, particularly organized crime. So it is to the benefit of both organized criminal elements in certain regions and Ukrainian nationalists in that same region to reach an understanding with each other and to work together. And the consequences of not doing so are shown in certain high-profile assassinations that have taken place over the past few months, including Irina Farion in Lvov and Dimian Ganul in Odessa. Both of them, on the one hand, have been portrayed in the Ukrainian media as civic activists on the right, but at the same time, it was widely known, especially in the case of Ganul, that he was also very heavily involved in patronizing the criminal element. So how to deal with this by the Ukrainian government is becoming an extremely urgent issue. It was always, I think, important for the Ukrainian government, no matter what it was. But if the Ukrainian government was to be deemed legitimate and have the ability to actually rule the country, it would have to tame or co-opt political and military forces that it did not control, because you cannot claim to be the legitimate government and institute the rule of law and order if militarized segments of the society do not recognize your authority to do so. They are essentially in a civil revolt against legitimate authority, and no government can tolerate that for long. One of the problems with Ukraine is that they've had to tolerate it for at least 10 years now. And one could argue that it goes back even further than that. But these organized paramilitary groups, even when they fight within as divisions of the Ukrainian military, are always willing to point out to whoever asks them that their allegiance to the Ukrainian government is limited and conditional. It is conditional on that government doing the right thing. So there is an open-ended threat there to this and any future Ukrainian government, that if that government does not pursue the course that the nationalist wants, then their legitimacy will be challenged not only in the political arena, but by military, perhaps even a military coup or military uprising. And that is why in the peace negotiations that are now underway and looking toward the end of the war, one of the big questions that Ukraine itself will have to deal with, it is very difficult for me to see how Russia can deal with it from the outside, or any European backers can deal with this from the outside. It has to be the Ukrainian government itself, which essentially brings these forces under control, disarms them, and demands that they show loyalty to the existing Ukrainian government, whatever it will be, and the Ukrainian constitution. Because without that, there can be no stability in Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian society.
Yeah, I guess my last question is a lot of this, we always say we stand by Ukraine, which is, again, a very divided bloc in terms of who rules this.
Right.
But a lot of this unity within Ukraine seemed to have been premised on the continuity of the war, which is why ending the war could be bad, because as long as it's an anti-Russian alliance, they all can kind of fall into line. But you have Zelensky, you have different other political groups, you have the nationalists, the military. A lot of these are obviously in tensions. And I remember initially when Zelensky was running, the nationalists were not too happy with him. I'm not sure if it was because of his Jewish background, but at least a lot of focus was on his more flamboyant characters which he had played in the different comedy career. Many of not only were a lot of his movie careers, actually the movies I saw of him before all of this was in Russian movies. That's how I knew him actually.
Right.
But he was again known for a lot of this flamboyant or half naked scenes, and this is was enough for many, I guess, to not consider him too great. But on the other hand, he proved to be very good at managing the West as well, getting weapons and all of this. So but this is, as you said, this is to some extent, I guess, a marriage of convenience. So if they're going to start turn on each other towards the end of the war, where does the military land on this? Are they with Zelensky here? Because if Zelensky looks like it's not going to last, then indeed, when the Americans are more or less communicating clearly to the Ukrainians the reason why, well, they put it back on, but the reason why I didn't get the military weapons or intelligence is because of Zelensky. We can't deal with him. They're kind of putting a target on him, and also suggesting that he might be a dictator, that he might not be legitimate. If you see all this pressure on Zelensky, where does the military fall? Will they go against the nationalists who would be essentially for perpetual war, or would they go with Zelensky, who's seen as being stripped of his legitimacy and being how can the or is the military itself not one united force? How does this work?
A military inevitably, I think, reflects the nature of the society from which it is drawn. And since, in my view, Ukrainian society is divided, during wartime, these divisions are suppressed or covered over, I should say, by the desire of the average person to be loyal and to defend his homeland. And that's a natural desire, and I think most people automatically do that. Once that situation of force majeure is taken away, the old problems that exist in society will resurface. I was struck, and I was looking this up while you were talking, by a report in the government-sponsored newspaper Ukrainska Pravda in December of 2024 that cited surveys that said that the so-called pro-Russian parties, whatever they may be called, because they've had to rename themselves and been largely suppressed in the country, but some party that represents the traditional interests of the East and South, whatever those parties are called, even today, they can count on 20 to 30% of the electorate. That's Ukrainska Pravda, the pro-government newspaper, reporting in December of last year. So this problem remains, and it's easy to imagine any number of scenarios involving the military, I should say, Ukrainian military getting involved in politics in some fashion. It could be through a former military commander, like Zaluzhny, becoming a candidate. Or it could be through the emergence in politics of more and other military commanders. But I think ultimately you will see these, there doesn't seem to be anyone currently on the horizon who could unite the entire country because, not because of who they are, but because they do not seem to be capable of embracing a program of the kind that has historically united Ukrainians, be it in 2019, the last elections, be it in 2014 or 15, or in 2010 before that. The unified platform that the vast majority of Ukrainians have supported over the last 10 or 15 years has been peace at home and peace with Russia. Without going into details about how that is to be accomplished, if any political candidate espoused those two goals, they could rely on winning both in the East and the West. And that was true of Poroshenko when he ran, and of Zelensky when he ran, and of course of Yanukovych when he ran against Viktor Yushchenko. It was always what we would call today a peace platform. You know, this is purely speculating, but it does seem to me that if you had a relatively popular or someone with a good reputation, a military commander with a good reputation, who could and would be willing to indeed espouse a peace platform of reconciliation within Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, that would be a powerful combination, and might change the current equation, which is very difficult to see a way out of right now. because the actions of the government in power are very difficult to predict. The actions of the opposition are very difficult to predict. Poroshenko has been speaking recently about Zelensky being on the path to dictatorship in an interview in Die Welt. Yulia Tymoshenko has said that the West has betrayed Ukraine and can no longer be trusted. Right now, everyone is in disarray. And the military doesn't seem to be in any better shape right now. So hopefully someone can emerge who has credibility in the political arena, military credentials to boot, but willing to espouse and promote a peace platform. That would seem to me to be a winning combination, but there doesn't seem to be a candidate like that so far.
No, not with the credibility. This is a difficult one. I know Arestovich, the former advisor of Zelensky, he has changed his position somewhat, but he doesn't have
and so often.
And so often, and I think this is bad for the credit. No, he was very gung-ho on war initially, but then now it's not just turned on Zelensky, but he's a presidential candidate. But he hasn't just turned on Zelensky, but he's also been very critical of the way the Bandera ideology has been embraced as a new national identity for Ukraine. And he argued also that by pushing this, Ukraine alienated millions of Ukrainians who now become second-rate citizens. That is millions of Ukrainians who could have supported the war and fought with, and who instead now see the government as an enemy. So also he's very critical of the Europeans and Americans, by the way. He argued once that, they didn't let us make peace 3 years ago. They still don't let us make peace. Of course, he might be changing his own history there, but everyone seems to be turning on each other. So it does beg the question where this is going to end up. And if peace breaks out, then there might be even intensify, I guess, these internal divisions.
And that will, I think, no doubt be the case. I cannot take Arestovich very seriously, because anytime he says something, like if he were on the campaign trail today, it would be so easy to destroy his credibility by playing some clip from what he said 5 years ago. He's just been all over the map. And so he simply couldn't muster that kind of credibility among any electorate. Rather than gaining support, he would probably wind up alienating everybody if he actually stood for a candidate. The interesting question, perhaps, is if peace did break out, would the current European governments that are committed to rearmament and to a clearly anti-Russian position, or renewed containment of Russia at the minimum, what position would they take? Would they support peace? Could they afford not to support peace if it was seen as being something that would promote better relations between Ukraine and Russia? I don't know the answer to that. The current European leadership has driven itself into such a political and intellectual cul-de-sac that they have no way out but to continue to bang their head against the wall going forward, as the saying goes, until for as long as it takes. But as long as it takes to what? To essentially impoverish Europeans, I think, is the answer at this point.
Yeah, no, at the moment, I don't think it's possible. I don't think they would support a new peaceful government in Ukraine.
Right.
It's just the hatred for Russia is so intense now. There's no room for anything else, and Ukraine is the ultimate spearhead to use. So,
right.
Anyways, Professor Petro, I do appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.